out this improvement in the conditions of labor, which would split the American working class later on. It would be split by race especially, but also urban and rural. The Republicans start to counterattack very quickly during the war and thereafter. The most important thing is Taft-Hartley Act of 1946, which passed over a veto of Truman by a newly elected Republican Congress. Maybe it was 47, I may have that wrong, maybe after the election of 46. I think it was, sorry. And that law really restricted unions, and it really stopped a lot of the growth of the unions by outlawing things like flying pickets and solidarity strikes, wildcat strikes. You always hear about these injunctions. If you go on strike, the leader of the union usually gets thrown in jail because it's not a contractual difference if you can't go on strike. So there's all these rules about going on strike. If you go on strike when your contract is still in play, it's breaking the law now, and the leaders of your union can be jailed, no matter what the grievance might be. So it took away a lot of the weapons. And also, they approved right-to-work laws spread. These are the right-to-work states. They may remind you of something, the Old South plus the Great Plains. If you look at a map of the election of 2008, these would be the McCain states with a couple exceptions. This will be the election of 2012. Will look very similar, except there'll be more erosion up here to the Republicans, up in the Midwest. On top of that, we got McCarthyism in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, yeah. Right to work means you can't require that everybody join the union after a union election. If the union wins an election to represent the workers, they all are represented by the union. And with right to work, you have the right to work without a union. So it sounds very good, right to work, but it means right to work without a union. And of course, one of the powers of the union, one of the ways the unions get leverage is by having the right to represent everybody. So Republicans get back in the 50s, in 52, after the Korean War. Eisenhower is the heroic general. They have to put up this kind of liberal general to get elected. But they bring in Richard Nixon as vice president. And we have McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin. Joyce has kind of bipolar politics, as does California. And these are the glory days of J. Edgar Hoover and anti-communism. The days of the loyalty oath at UC, where 35 faculty were fired for not signing a loyalty oath to the state of California, that they were not working to undermine the legitimate government of California. So much for academic freedom, eh? Those are the good old days. But in the 60s, things turn around again, very much because of Kennedy's assassination and other reasons, prosperous times. You start to get the student and youth movements, counterculture, the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, of course, absolutely central to all this. And even environmentalism becomes a thorn in their side. And so the ruling class really takes a lot of hits in the 60s. It's really pushed back. A lot of pushback, a lot of new initiatives, getting new regulations. The defeat in Vietnam, as I told you in another lecture, they took very hard. That was not supposed to happen. A crummy little third world country was not supposed to defeat the United States, and yet it did. Why we're still in Afghanistan, God forbid, that we be defeated, that we claim, that we admit defeat. So there's a lot of thirst for revenge after that. And most histories you always hear about the 60s, and then hear about the great things, and hear about the excesses. What you never really hear about is the demonization of the 60s and the absolute kind of playing up of anything that's crazy or was wild and bizarre, drugs and rock and roll and yada, 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 free love and everything, which was really just the foam on the top of a boiling pot. It wasn't what brought it to a boil. So there's been a lot of demonization of the 60s. But probably more important is the growth of the think tanks, the right-wing think tanks to generate new policies and new guises to try to undermine all those overly liberal ideas of the 1960s. And the right, under Richard Viguerie, who's pictured here with Ronald Reagan, took a page from the left's organizing book and started doing things like mass mailings, popular organizing at the grassroots. Before, the Republicans had been this party of business, and then small-town business. But they never really done mass organizing. What do they have now? They have a lot of the evangelical churches. They have a lot of huge mailing lists. They got Fox News, and they got talk radio, and all these means of getting out to ordinary people and mobilizing getting conservative ideas in their heads and then mobilizing them to go out and vote for conservative causes. If you don't believe any of this, I suggest Kim Phillips' fine book, Invisible Hands, about how the business class systematically funds all these think tanks and the revival of what we now call neoliberalism during the triumphant period of New Deal liberalism. Now, they're all liberalism. The New Deal was still about keeping capitalism intact. It was liberal. It wasn't radical. I'm sure it's radical by today's standards. I can't forget the self-inflicted wounds that a lot of the labor movement was complicit with the McCarthyites in driving the left out of their unions after when the anti-communist movement was at its peak. The view was that all communists were working for Joe Stalin or something. But most of the American communists, a vast number of them, were just radicals who attached themselves to what seemed to be the best solution, and were not particularly Stalinists at all, and certainly not taking orders from Joe. But whatever, we can debate that at length. The fact is, when they kicked all the radicals out of the unions, a lot of the unions suffered. And there's one union, for example, the UE, United Electrical Workers, who had these big electrical plants, Westinghouse, General Electric, and so on, was about 500,000 strong. And once the radicals were thrown out, other unions moved in, took over its territory, much more conservative unions, and it shrank to nothing. One of the few unions that didn't kick the commies out was the International Longshoremen's Union on the Pacific Coast, and that's why they had radicals and were still demonstrating against the Vietnam War, the Central American intervention, the Afghan War, the Iraqi War. Funny thing. So the unions got much more conservative. They merged, the AFL and CIO merged, and kind of took on that old main of the AFL, kind of conservative, stable. We're just looking at wages. We don't want to talk about any other issues, and so on. In fact, they teamed up with the CIA. This guy, George Meany, when he was head of the AFL in the 50s and 60s, teamed up with the CIA to run union organizing efforts around the world to try and undermine unions that were regarded as too left in Europe or in Central America, Latin America, wherever. And they were quite successful at that because they had a lot of money. Business unionism tended to be about just getting contracts. There are big retirement funds that built up that were often very lucrative if you could invest them or get a piece of them. This is the era of Jimmy Hoffa here, and getting in bed with the mafia and the longshoremen. This is the kind of unions you see in that great post-war movie On the Waterfront, which is quite conservative in a lot of ways, except that it did speak to the reality that the East Coast waterfront unions were quite corrupt and conservative, unlike the West Coast unions. Unfortunately, the movie didn't put it on the West Coast. It's a different story. But very undemocratic. They'd had these leaders for 30 years. One of the worst incidents was in '69 when a dissident group in the United Farm Workers under Jock Yablonsky was going to win the next election, and so the president of the union had him gunned down in his bed. This doesn't help union organizing or the union image. The unions, of course, became often, most of the time, quite white and male, not responding to changes in the labor force or dealing with the exclusions of people of color or women from the rules of the 30s, or in agriculture where many of the black people and brown people were concentrated, and so on. So that was a real problem, and I can't go into all that, but the labor movement very split along racial lines, which we'll see later on when I talk about inequality. And the unions had this alliance from the 30s with the Democrats, and it worked for them right through the 1960s. But after that, it stopped working for them very well. And they poured lots of money and tremendous amounts of energy to get either in lost elections or elections of people who didn't actually get them any new rights or privileges or benefits or do anything to hold back the tide of neoliberalism. But it does show you, like here's voting for Gore in 2000. Union workers were more democratic. We're more to the left of non-union workers. So it makes a difference to your politics, too. Who you talk to, what your commitments are, what kind of education programs the unions have, and so on. Jerry Brown. The reason he beat Meg Whitfield is because of the unions. Whitman. Whitfield? Oh, sorry. I got so much antihistamine in me, I don't know what I'm saying. Anyway, the reason he beat Meg Whitman, he had no organizing, he had no field organization, no big party organization. It was the unions got him elected. And as usual, he immediately then vetoes a bill protecting farm workers. So there we go, another Democrat. Although he did approve some other bills that the unions are behind. Okay, so let's get to neoliberalism at home. There's a dramatic political turn at the end of the 60s. Not so much the assassination of JFK, because that actually, on the sympathy vote, is what ushers in this massive supermajority of Johnson in 1964, which gets so much progressive social legislation passed in 64, 60, and 65. It's kind of like when Roosevelt came in 33 with this massive plurality because of the total collapse of the Republicans. Well, Goldwater's defeat in 64 they ushered in this massive plurality, mega majority of the Democrats, which is when you got a lot of this progressive civil rights, housing, and other Medicare and other legislation like that. But by 68, Johnson, the anti-war movement, has undermined Lyndon Johnson despite his liberal domestic policy. He then decides not to run. And Humphrey ends up running against Nixon. Nixon, who everybody thought was out of politics after he lost the governor race in California in 1962, comes back. And it took him 6 years before, of course, the scandal of Watergate brought him down, and he had to resign, which did bring back another Democratic president in 1976, Jimmy Carter. Otherwise, we've had a pretty continuous string of Republicans, if you haven't noticed. Except for FDR, we've had almost nothing but Republicans since the Civil War. At the very top, it's a very conservative country. Outside of Washington, you got, where's everybody going? Really? Okay. I guess they're concerning after time. New York, the fiscal crisis in New York, when the feds let New York go bankrupt, kind of like letting Lehman Brothers go down in 2008. They let it go down. And they did it for very political reasons, as they did for Lehman Brothers, by the way. And that's the beginning of David Harvey's book, you'll see, about the rise of neoliberalism. Nixon and his strategists launched the Southern Strategy in the 68 election, 72, or actually more for 72, I would say. And through the 70s, the Republicans start organizing the South, where they get the backlash to civil rights, and the fact that the South is more conservative and aligns much more naturally with the Republicans by this time. So it goes to the Republicans. The new upper middle class suburbs around places like Houston and Phoenix go Republican. And so the Republicans have this very overtly spatial, geographic electoral strategy, which works very well. And then behind this kind of wave of conventional electoral organizing going on with the Republicans and Nixon, there's the rise of the new right. And this goes back to organizing in the early 60s for Goldwater, that the Republicans were not right-wing enough. And you see that today, of course. Rick Perry says one thing in favor of Texas's equivalent of the DREAM Act, and he's dead meat. That's the super right within the Republicans, who are very dominant right now. And Perry is not exactly a liberal. He's very, very conservative. This is a guy, how many people has he put to death and so on? I mean, he's a very conservative guy. He's to the right of George Bush. And yet, that's not right-wing enough, apparently. Well, that was true of the Goldwater rights. And they got crushed in 64, but they came back. And they organized, and the new darling was Ronald Reagan. And lo and behold, Reagan gets elected governor in California in 66 and 70. He's then elected. Nobody thinks he can possibly win. He was about as popular as Michelle Bachmann in 1970. And by 1980, he's president, so you never know. Stay tuned. And Reagan, like Thatcher in England, introduces a systematic policy shift to the right that we now call neoliberalism. It was then called neoconservatism. But it was a whole host of things I'm going to talk about. And meanwhile, at the local and state level, there's a lot of launching of neoliberalism as well. Particularly, California leads the way, as we led the way by electing Reagan and Nixon before that, and we get Proposition 13 in 1978. And all the fiscal troubles to this day are deeply tied to Proposition 13, which de-taxes real estate. Reagan immediately, as the question earlier, he immediately launches an offensive against the public unions. He breaks the PATCO, which is the Traffic Controllers Union, which represents, traffic controllers all work for the FAA at that time, and he refused to get into an imbroglio with the FAA, and he just fires them all, thousands, and puts in replacement guys, which, by the way, they could do only because of the Vietnam War. They had so many military people who'd been trained as pilots and as air traffic controllers because of the war that you could plug them in there without a labor shortage. And, of course, we're back to that. That has never stopped. But there was kind of a lull in it. You didn't see a lot of the attack on the public unions until recently. Its return with Scott Walker, no relation, in Wisconsin. Deregulation, a major feature of Reaganism, neoliberalism, deregulating telecoms, deregulating telecoms, the financial system, well, we're all aware of that now, right? But also the phone system was broken up. the old AT&T system. Media deregulation, Various Communications Act, why you can have so much advertising now that you couldn't have when I was a kid. Why you can have usurious interest rates you couldn't have when I was young, and so on and so on. And generally the enforcement has gone down. Okay, and all the argument that this would be more efficient, you get more markets, markets would function to give you better service, more efficiency, and so on. Now, obviously, there's some truth to the idea that markets can produce efficiency and innovation and so on. But as studies have shown, things like airline deregulation, what happened is you basically busted the unions. And by busting the unions, you drive the wages down, and that's where your cheaper tickets come from. So, you take from one end and you give to the other. Tax cuts, of course, become a big part of this, and we'll, of course, talk more about that before we're done. But tax cuts across the board, not just income taxes, income tax rates, but inheritance taxes, capital gains taxes, key taxes on wealth, both under Reagan and then under the Bushes, particularly Bush 2. Social services come in, government is bloated. Now, military was never too bloated for Reagan. In fact, he did a huge military buildup in the 1980s. I should have shown you a chart of that. He did the greatest military buildup since the Vietnam War, after the Vietnam War, which pumped a lot of money into the economy, and especially went to his military contractor friends down in Southern California, where he was very well connected. Plus, he was a kind of military guy, a militaristic guy who had to be strong against the communists and so on. But the main budget cutting, as it has right to the present, is on things like education, social welfare kind of functions, strict aid to families with dependents, general assistance, housing subsidies, and so on. Now, Nixon had started all this, and Reagan ramped it up to a kind of fanatic level. So here's our spending on non-aged people as a percent of GDP. Now, this is after Reagan has started cutting. By 1987, you can see the U.S. just above Portugal there, and well behind all European countries, even the U.K. already by 87. You wonder why California went from the top of the ranks in per pupil spending in public schools. We were in the top 5. We've been permanently in the bottom 5 ever since Prop 13. Why is that? No money. No tax, you don't have money. Don't have money, you can't spend. And then you blame the schools for not performing. It's a perfect circle. Law and order becomes a big part of this era. That's a whole other class, a whole other lecture, a whole other course. Criminalization of the unemployed, of youth that are going nowhere because they have nowhere to go. The war on drugs started under, actually the war on crime starts under Nixon, the war on drugs under Reagan. It's been a huge success, as you well know. Incredibly draconian laws. The one public works that we build in California when we're not building, because we're not building universities, is prisons in the 80s and 90s. The growth of police, you can't believe how many more police there are today than there used to be. But again, you're used to that, so you think it's like homework. That anytime you move, there's a policeman or a security guard. Didn't exist. Judges moved to the right, Supreme Court moved to the right. The whole liberal Supreme Court, the liberals on the Supreme Court of California, all thrown out in the 80s by a recall election, engineered by the then mayor, the later mayor of LA. What's his name? Shoot, well, can't remember. Huh? No, it was not. The courts moved to the right. I thought this was a nice statistic I plucked out of, I think, The Economist. Supreme Court decisions supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Just in your lifetime, how they've gone up. The Roberts Court since 2009, things like killing the Walmart sex discrimination case. How many women were in that? 3 million in that class action suit, or was that my exaggeration? Maybe it was only 500,000. Campaign, the Citizens United case about unlimited corporate contributions to elections and so on. Now, the Supreme Court has mostly been very right-wing through the whole of American history, so don't be surprised by that. There was this one little blip. There were a couple little blips in the progressive era with Brandeis and Holmes, briefly, social legislation, and then again with the Warren Court. Although, as Eisenhower said, the appointment of Warren as Chief Justice was the greatest mistake he ever made. Nobody predicted Warren would move to the left. And now we're back safely with an extremely right-wing Supreme Court. And the Democrats, of course, capitulate. You think the Democrats are liberal. The Democrats are a joke. They're not liberal at all. They are neoliberal. Obama's a neoliberal. Clinton was a neoliberal. There hasn't been any liberal Democrats since the first couple of years of Jimmy Carter, and even he turned tail his last couple of years. The Democratic Leadership Council, started by this smiling fellow here, to move the Democrats to the right intentionally so they could win elections, so he wins in 92. And he says he's going to really do a lot of stuff. And what does he do? He actually passes a whole lot of Republican legislation, media deregulation, punishing, taking women off welfare, putting a wall up along the border. That's all Clinton. And they were all Republican ideas. That's pretty interesting. And Obama, we all thought Obama would be different, but of course, he never said he'd be different, and he isn't. He's a neoliberal too. And he takes his money from the bankers and he tries to cut deals with the Republicans. Of course, none of it works, so he's a little shocked about that, I think. So, now I'm going to have to cut this a little short, but there has been some revival of the labor movement since the 1990s. California, in particular, now has done more organizing. There's been more labor organizing in California the last 20 years than any other part of the country partly because we had a very robust economy, certainly in the 90s. A lot of the old union leadership was thrown out. Unions have changed. They have lots of women, lots of people of color. It's quite a different world than it used to be in the unions. And they've also changed. The top leadership has become much more progressive, interested in organizing, outspoken. Trump is saying we're not going to support Obama unless we see some results, instead of committing to the Democrat a year ahead. And at the bottom, a lot of new organizing. New strategies of organizing, like community organizing, led by people like Amy Dean. Here has written this book, A New Deal. Used to be down in San Jose. Did a lot of great organizing down there, back in Illinois now. Lots of organizing in services.